Burkina Faso just did something small on paper, but massive in impact. Over 2,500 escort motorcycles were purchased for the national police under President Ibrahim Traore. At first, it sounds like logistics, just equipment, just vehicles. But within weeks, something shifted across the country. Truck drivers noticed fewer illegal roadblocks. Market traders felt safer traveling at night. Villages that hadn't seen a patrol in years suddenly did. There was no dramatic announcement, no parade, no breaking news alert. Yet the effect was real. So the real question isn't what happened, it's why something this simple changed so much. Let's find out. What changed first was not fear, not territory, not power. It was time. Before, when something went wrong in a village outside Ouagadougou, the clock worked against the people. A call was made, a report was written. Someone waited for a vehicle. Fuel had to be arranged. Approval had to move through offices. By the time anyone arrived, the attackers were already gone, the damage already done, the witnesses already silent. The system was designed to move slowly, not by accident, but by structure. In Burkina Faso, distance is not measured in kilometers. It is measured in hours. Roads disappear into dust, bridges vanish in the rainy season, cars break down, radios lose signal. Every delay stretched the same message across the country. The state exists on paper, not in time. Then that rhythm broke. Police units began arriving while the problem was still happening. Not afterward, not when the smoke had settled, but in the middle of the crisis itself. Villagers noticed it first. The sound of engines came sooner than expected. Officers showed up before people finished explaining what happened. It felt unnatural, as if time had been compressed. This was a real shock. Not the equipment, not the uniforms, the pace. For decades, insecurity survived on slowness. Armed groups planned around it. Smugglers depended on it. Everyone knew the state would come late, if at all. Speed belonged to those who broke the law. Now the balance was shifting. Response time was no longer a weakness. It became a weapon. This changed behavior before it changed outcomes. People stopped assuming nothing would happen. Criminals stopped assuming they had hours. The mental map of safety and risk began to rearrange itself. When time collapses, confidence changes sides. But this new speed did something else, something unexpected. It exposed the lie that the problem was money, training, or foreign help. None of those had changed. What changed was movement. The system stopped waiting to be perfect and started moving in real time. That is when the question stopped being about efficiency and became about geography. Because when time collapses, distance collapses with it. Places once considered too far, too remote, too disconnected suddenly felt closer. The state was no longer hours away. It was minutes away. The gap between danger and response closed, and that created a new reality. The state was no longer behind events. It was inside them. This is why the shift felt unsettling. People didn't see a policy change. They felt a time change. But this raised a deeper question. If speed could collapse time, what would it do to the parts of the country that had been invisible for years? What happens when places once beyond reach suddenly become reachable? It turned unreachable places into reachable ones. Once response time collapsed, something else quietly followed. The country itself began to feel smaller. Villages that had always lived beyond the state's shadow suddenly felt close to it. Roads that once marked the edge of authority became normal patrol routes. Dirt paths, border corridors, and market tracks that were never mapped into any security plan now had regular movement. What used to be too far stopped being a reason. For years, distance protected danger. Not because it was powerful, but because it was ignored. Entire regions existed outside real enforcement simply because cars could not survive the terrain, and trucks could not move fast enough. The state's reach ended where asphalt ended, now that the border no longer exists. The new mobility changed how the territory itself was experienced. Communities stopped seeing themselves as forgotten. Traders no longer felt like they were gambling with their lives just to move goods. The presence of uniformed patrols was no longer an event. It became routine. And routine is how authority becomes real. But this shift did not just protect civilians. It also disrupted something else that had quietly controlled the countryside for years. Hidden networks relied on geography as cover. Smuggling routes followed dirt paths. Armed groups used border zones like open doors. They didn't need numbers or weapons. They only needed space that the state could not enter. Once that space disappeared, their advantage disappeared with it. Once invisible paths became watched. Once safe routes became uncertain. Territory stopped being a shield. The map of risk flipped. Instead of the state avoiding remote areas, criminals began avoiding them. This is when the change stopped being symbolic and became strategic. Control was no longer about buildings or borders. It was about movement through space. Every patrol rewrote the meaning of the land. Every reclaimed became a message. This is no longer empty. But something else shifted in the minds of the people. When communities saw a consistent presence, they stopped whispering. They stopped assuming nothing would change. They started reporting, guiding, and cooperating. Geography had been the wall between citizens and the state. Now that the wall is gone. And that created a dangerous situation for those who depended on silence. Because when the map closes, hiding becomes harder. Yet one question remained. If the state could now move everywhere, who was losing the most? Who was threatened when blind zones vanished? They were the ones who lost the most. The criminals, the traffickers, the armed groups that had survived not because they were powerful, but because they were faster than the system. For years, they treated geography like armor. They memorized every dirt path, every dry riverbed, every border shortcut. They knew which villages were invisible and which roads were never patrolled. Their strength was not in numbers or weapons. It was in knowing where the state could not go. That advantage collapsed. When patrols began moving through those same routes, unpredictably and continuously, escape stopped being guaranteed. There were no more safe corridors, no more predictable blind spots, no more hours to disappear before anyone arrived. Movement itself became risky. This is how the power balance shifted. Not through force, through uncertainty. Groups that once controlled territory through fear now had to constantly relocate. Supply chains slowed. Communication became cautious. Operations that relied on timing lost rhythm. The terrain stopped working for them. And this created a pressure they had never faced before. Constant exposure. They could no longer blend into silence. They could no longer rely on delay. They could no longer count on distance to protect them. But the real transformation was not in what criminals lost. It was in what civilians gained. For the first time in years, communities noticed something unfamiliar. Fear was shrinking. Not disappearing, shrinking. People stayed longer in markets. Transport resumed on roads once avoided. Night travel slowly returned. This wasn't bravery. It was a new sense of possibility. The psychological weight of insecurity began lifting, not because the threat vanished, but because the response was no longer absent. And that changed behavior. People spoke up. They shared information. They stopped treating danger as normal. This is the moment when security stopped being a government issue and became a collective one. But this raised a new tension. Because once civilians begin trusting the state again, they stopped turning elsewhere for protection. They stopped waiting for foreign forces. They stopped believing safety must come from outside. Which leads to the next shift. If fear was no longer controlling daily life, what replaced it? What happens when people start believing in their own institutions again? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. It replaced fear with participation. Not overnight, not all at once, but slowly, in small, quiet ways that changed everything. When people saw the police arrive on time again and again, something inside communities shifted. They stopped seeing security as a distant promise and started experiencing it as a real presence. It was no longer a rumor. It was visible, audible, moving through their streets. And that visibility did something powerful. It broke the silence. For years, people avoided speaking, not because they supported crime or violence, but because they believed nothing would happen. Reports felt useless. Complaints felt dangerous. Silence felt safer than hope. That silence began to fade. Villagers started calling again. Traders began reporting suspicious movements. Communities began guiding patrols through their own terrain. This was not forced cooperation, it was earned. And the more people spoke, the more effective security became. The system began feeding itself. Presence created trust, trust created information, and information created precision. Security stopped being a distant institution and became a shared responsibility. But something deeper was happening beneath the surface. For decades, Burkina Faso's safety had been framed as something that needed foreign oversight. Outside forces, external training, international coordination. People were taught to believe that protection had to come from somewhere else. Now that belief was weakening, because people were witnessing something new, their own state acting in real time. This changed the emotional contract between citizens and authority. They stopped waiting for outsiders to fix what they now saw being handled locally. And this is where the shift became political, even without speeches. The state was no longer a guest in its own territory. It was reclaiming legitimacy. That legitimacy didn't come from uniforms. It came from reliability. And reliability is what builds sovereignty from the ground up. But this new relationship had consequences beyond trust. Once people stopped looking outward for protection, the logic of dependency began to crack. External control lost its emotional hold. Assistance stopped feeling necessary. Partnership stopped feeling superior. A country that believes in its own capacity does not accept being managed. This is the quiet revolution, not shouted, not televised, but lived. And this raised the most dangerous question of all for the old system. If Burkina Faso can protect itself, what happens to the structures that once claimed it could not? What breaks when a nation no longer waits for permission to defend itself? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. It broke the habit of waiting. For years, security operations in Burkina Faso were slowed by invisible chains. Not because officers lacked courage, but because decisions had to pass through layers of coordination, fuel approvals, foreign advisories, and external partnerships. Even when threats were clear, action waited for permission. The system moved only when someone outside said yes. That logic is now collapsing. With internal mobility restored, operations no longer pause for foreign schedules or outside logistics. Units move when intelligence arrives, not when approval does. Decisions are made locally. Resources are used immediately. The system stops asking and starts acting. This shift is not loud, but it is radical. It changes who controls time. It changes who controls space. It changes who controls security. When a country can respond instantly, it stops being managed. It stops being supervised. It stops being dependent. This is why the change feels bigger than the equipment. It rewrites authority. The power to act in real time is the power to define reality. No foreign timetable, no external delay, no waiting for permission. And this independence sends a message far beyond Burkina Faso. It tells other African nations that sovereignty is not symbolic. It is operational. It is built through systems that move, not through speeches that promise. The youth feel this shift immediately. They don't see bikes. They see proof that the old narrative is ending. The narrative that Africa must be guided. The narrative that Africa must be trained. The narrative that Africa must wait. That story is losing its audience. This is not about rejecting help. It is about rejecting control. Because when protection is internal, influence from outside weakens. Security becomes a national function again, not a foreign project. And when security is yours, your future is yours. That is why this moment matters. It signals that Burkina Faso is no longer negotiating its right to exist safely. It is claiming it. But this creates one final shift, not in policy, not in power, but in identity. Because when a country stops waiting, it begins to see itself differently. What does this new self-image mean for Africa's next generation? It created belief. Not belief in words, belief in capacity. For generations, Africans were taught directly and indirectly that progress arrives from outside, that security must be supervised, that order must be imported. Those solutions must be approved. This was not just policy. It became psychology. It shaped how nations saw themselves. What happened in Burkina Faso disrupted that mental architecture. When people witnessed a system working in real time, built with local decisions and local control, something deeper shifted. The question stopped being, who will save us, and became, what can we build? This is not pride for the sake of pride. This is identity rooted in action. The youth feel it most clearly. They are tired of watching leaders negotiate their dignity, tired of seeing Africa portrayed as a project instead of a power, tired of being told to wait for permission to exist fully. Now they see a state that moves. They see authority without apology. They see sovereignty without translation. And that image changes how they imagine the future. Not as something delayed, not as something conditional, but as something owned. This is why motorcycles matter. Not because of metal or engines, but because they represent motion without dependence. They are proof that systems can be rebuilt from within. Those solutions do not need validation. That Africa does not need to perform weakness to be accepted. Traore did not make a speech about revolution. He reprogrammed how power functions. The state now moves at the speed of its people, not at the speed of foreign approval. That is the shift that cannot be undone. Once people experience self-directed progress, they do not unlearn it. Once a nation feels its own capacity, it does not return to submission. This is the beginning of a different story for Africa. Not a story of catching up, not a story of dependency, but a story of direction. And it starts with movement, because movement is a choice. Movement is power. Movement is freedom. And now the final question stands. If Burkina Faso can rewrite its future this way, which nation will move next? Let us know in the comment section. Will more nations do the same? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about, the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.